Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Jean Boda. I'm the Executive Director with the Alberta Community Crime Prevention Association, commonly known as ACPA in Alberta. In May of this year, ACPA will be hosting its annual Crime Prevention Conference in Edmonton, Alberta. Our dates, May 5th through the 7th. In anticipation of this exciting event, we are hosting a series of interviews with our conference presenters. This morning, I'm delighted to be interviewing Mr. Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting Limited. Mr. Gurski will be hosting a presentation entitled, Why Communities Are an Indispensable Resource for Community Safety, for Public Safety. We're delighted that you could join us today, Phil. Would you mind giving us a little bit of background on yourself?
Sure. So first of all, Jean, thank you for allowing me to do this bit of an interview before the conference in May, which I'm looking very forward to. Spent a lot of time in Edmonton when I was working, so I'm looking forward to getting back there. In a nutshell, without going into too much detail, I spent 32 years in intelligence in Canada, starting my career with Communications Security Establishment, or CSE, Signals Intelligence, where I spent 17 and a half years. Focusing on the Middle East. I was a multilingual analyst. Farsi and Arabic were two of my specialties. And then in 2001, in January of that year, I moved to CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, initially as an Iranian analyst, which again was something I'd focused on for the better part of a decade and a half. But then, of course, 9/11 happened, and I became an Islamist terrorism, counterterrorism specialist. And that's what I spent my time at CSIS doing, looking at people, cells, groups here in Canada, as well as Canadians who went abroad to join groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. And then I retired from CSIS in 2015, worked very briefly for the Ontario Provincial Police's anti-terrorism section as an advisor on their investigations. And since my so-called retirement, I've written 8 books, 7 of them on terrorism, and still maintain a currency on what's happening vis-a-vis terrorism around the world on a daily basis.
Excellent. That is so interesting. My goodness, that's amazing. When it comes to your presentation at our upcoming conference, I understand that one of the things you intend to address is the value of information for law enforcement and security agencies. Will you be sharing how this information is sourced?
Yes, to a large extent. So obviously, when you work in those two fields, you must be very careful with regard to the nature of your sources. So those of us who worked in intelligence go to our graves protecting 2 things, sources and methods. Because if you betray the sources or methods, the sources or methods tend to disappear. And so you become blind and deaf to what's actually happening. But when it comes to community safety writ large, security services don't rely solely on secret sources or agents, or in the terminology used at CSIS were human sources. We rely on information from a variety of angles, a variety of sectors. And as a security service, we vet the information for accuracy. We try to corroborate information from multiple sources, because any one source can be misleading, only partially correct, or in some cases dealing with disinformation or misinformation. And as part of my career, I would go across the country and talk about terrorism, more narrowly Islamist terrorism, and the phenomenon called radicalization, which means how people become terrorists in the first place. What are the things they say, the things they do, the things they post online, and when does it become problematic? And we learned very quickly that, as good as we were as a security service, we're a country of, well, back then, 35 million Canadians. You can't know everything. You rely very much on the tips that are provided to you, much the same way that law enforcement relies on tips from the general public as well. So we realized that we had to engage Canadians. As a security service, that was a little more difficult given the secrecy of what we do, a little easier for law enforcement. But I learned that talking to Canadians about this was a great way to learn more about what was happening on the ground.
Excellent. Excellent. That's very interesting. Yeah, we don't think of it as being 2 separate things, what law enforcement, where they get their sources, what their sources are, and what you guys would. That's very interesting. So aside from the sources, do these organizations sometimes obtain valuable information from regular people, which you may have touched on a bit?
Yeah, 100%. So if you're in law enforcement, if someone dials 911 because they see a crime in progress, that's obviously information coming from the public.
Yeah.
And law enforcement can use that to try and stop bad things from happening, et cetera. So let me give you a simple example, Gene. A few months ago, my wife and I were all driving one night, and we saw a car ahead of us that was weaving across the center lane. Could have been the winds, could have been the road conditions, but I thought, I'm going to call in just to make sure. This could be a drunk driver, and the last
Hmm.
thing I want to see is someone, being hurt or killed by a drunk driver. So I called 911 and said, "This is what we're seeing." Of course, I have no idea what happened to the information, but I felt as a concerned and responsible citizen, I had to do that. The same thing goes for, national security and public safety issues. If people see things or hear things that are problematic, it's best just to report them. Now, there
Yeah.
are challenges that, which I'll get to probably later on, but to me, a better informed law enforcement agency or security intelligence agency is a better agency able to fulfill its mandate. And I would like
Yeah.
to encourage Canadians, average citizens, to not be afraid to pick up the phone
Yeah.
and share their concerns with these agencies.
And I think that's something that we think is in a faraway land somewhere, right? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
It's
we do. Look at Gene. We are a very safe country here in Canada.
yeah, yeah,
I've been doing counterterrorism for the better part of 25 years now, and we don't have the problems that, you know,
yeah,
African countries or Asian countries or even most of our Western European allies have.
yeah,
But it's not perfect, and we shouldn't take that for granted. And I think sometimes there's a hesitation to share information. What's going
yeah,
to happen to it? How's it going to be used? Will I get in trouble? Will I get somebody else in trouble? Am I misreading what I'm seeing? Is it really that important? And my advice is, there's a saying, I think the Australians have it on their sort of public website, see it, say it.
yeah,
If there's something that you think might be not good,
yeah,
uh, just report it. You
yeah,
don't know what's going to happen to it. It may be nothing, but it
yeah.
may be one piece of a puzzle that contributes to other
That,
pieces of a puzzle that the law
yeah,
enforcement already have in their hands.
that's exactly. I agree. And we use that often when we're talking to communities about just reporting this is to law enforcement,
Yeah,
but it might be part of that little puzzle, right?
yeah, exactly.
They need it. Do these organizations value community partnerships?
Again, the same thing. So, at the sort of secret level, you're recruiting your human sources from within these communities.
Mhm.
Um, the only way to infiltrate a terrorist cell is to basically find someone that you trust that can report back to you what the terrorist cell is all about. So then those come from within the community. There's a negative connotation to that sometimes. Well, you're spying on the community. No, you're not spying on the community. You're spying on individuals within the community who mean to do harm. And this is
Mhm.
something which really worries me, I think, Gene, in a general sense here in Canada, is that some communities think that somehow the community itself has been systemically targeted. That is categorically false.
Mhm.
CSIS or the RCMP or Edmonton Police have neither the interest, the time, nor the resources to target a community.
Yeah,
They are targeting individuals who have the possible intention of carrying out acts that are illegal or possibly violent in nature. That's
yeah,
what they focus on. That they
yeah,
come from a certain community is kind of largely irrelevant. They
yeah,
come from many communities. So I
yeah,
wish that we did a better job of explaining why we do what we do,
yeah,
and therefore that communities would trust us enough to share the information with us. But we couldn't do our job without the communities. And let's face it, we are a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual country, and proudly so. And I think people are hesitant to come forward. Maybe it's because of things they saw back in their homelands,
yeah,
where law enforcement security were not as trusted as they are here in Canada. Or
right.
maybe they simply don't want to get involved, which is the kind of classic, studies have shown that. But I just wish that we did a better job of telling people why we do what they do to gain their trust so they wouldn't hesitate to pick up the phone or send an email when they see things that have gone awry.
I agree with you. I agree. Well, and you look at a lot of your hate crime right now and what's going on in some communities. And I'm only speaking from experience and seeing it and not experiencing it, but having people tell me about it. Yeah, it's like you say, and you're right. A lot of times there's a fear,
Mhm.
or and sometimes there's just well somebody else will look
Yeah.
at, right? Which is not always right, but no. Excellent. Over the course of your impressive career, you've built up a vast wealth of knowledge and insights about things like national security and radicalization. Just to name a few, two areas of your expertise. If possible, could you share an instance where an individual was, I wouldn't say rescued, but apprehended from intense radicalization?
Wow, that's a great question. It's often really difficult to make that determination because let me give you a counterexample, Gina, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
So in October of 2014, a Canadian soldier was killed just outside of Montreal by a young man who wanted to join ISIS. And yet had been prohibited from doing so because his passport had been seized by Passport Canada. He had been talked to by the RCMP and I believe the Quebec police at some point in the weeks just prior to his attack. And he convinced them that he had changed his mind. He realized he was going down the wrong pathway. What was I thinking? This is just stupid. Thank you for talking to me. I've seen the light. I'm not going to do this. And 3 weeks later, he killed this soldier and ran him down in his car. So there are no guarantees that you can divert somebody from the pathway. And now you have an excellent program in Alberta called the Office for the Prevention of Violence, or OPV, with which I'm very familiar. I know some of the people that work in that very, very well. Fantastic efforts, but measuring whether or not you're successful or not is very, very difficult because what you're trying to do is read people's minds. And determine is what they're telling us is true. And I'll give you another case where we interviewed a young man, a teenager, who was exhibiting signs of radicalization, and he seemed to understand why we were concerned. And he kind of sort of decreased his activities in the immediate aftermath. And then 5 years later, he came back on our radar doing the exact same thing again. So again, really hard to come up with classic examples. I do know some people who on the far right who seem to have abandoned that cause over a period of time.
Yeah.
There's also reports of people who've actually been incarcerated, convicted of terrorism offenses, who are now free, who claim to have abandoned the cause. But again, I have as many counterexamples as I have examples. So it's a great question. And I think that people who are involved in, so-called counter-radicalization, de-radicalization, preventing PVE, preventing violent extremism, these are wonderful efforts, and I commend people that work in them. The problem is, how do you determine when you're successful or not? And I'm sorry, but as a former practitioner, my working assumption, until you prove otherwise, is once a terrorist, always a terrorist. I'm not saying people don't change their minds. Obviously, they do. But as a practitioner, I can't take the risk that to believe you sort of holus bolus and take you at your word for fear that 6 months, 7 months, whatever down the road, you're going to re-engage in that activity and do something awful, as we've seen happen here in Canada. So it's a really difficult question to answer. And bottom line is that there are no certainties in this field. Doesn't mean the work shouldn't continue. But I think we have to be cautious in trying to make an absolute determination that person X will never re-engage in the ideology that may lead them down a violent pathway.
I agree. Yeah, an excellent comments. And also, I think sometimes we think this just happens to people that have immigrated or come into our country, or it happens to foreigners. But we also have this homegrown radicalization, which I know a lot of communities don't like to be reminded of sometimes. So it's an interesting field. It really interests me. Why you go there, what happens, like you say, but measuring how successful someone is, it's hard. It's very.
If I could add, Jean, when I retired from CSIS in 2015, I came out with my first book called The Threat from Within, which was looking at radicalization in the West, more specifically in Canada, and was based on my time at CSIS. So no secrets were divulged. It was all open source information, but it was my perspective on things. And what I try to demonstrate in the book were two things. First of all, there were indicators. There were behavioral and sort of intellectual behaviors that pointed towards someone's radicalizing. Whether they were going to engage in violence, again, that's really hard to determine. The second thing is, and there's more to your point, it's not just people who are, financially not well off, or people who are uneducated, or people with criminal backgrounds, or people with mental health issues, or recent immigrants. What we found in my time at CSIS was that anybody, and I stress anybody, can
Mhm.
radicalize the violence given the right, or I guess in this case, the wrong conditions. And yet
Yeah.
we have this mythology that there's some kind of a set of precursors that makes one
Mhm.
person more vulnerable than the other. And that simply is not true.
Right.
Any more than criminal behavior can be reduced to one's background. We have, very poor criminals. We have very rich criminals. And
Yeah.
I wish that Canadians would get rid of this idea that there's some kind of a pattern
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
some kind of a grab bag of characteristics that makes you more vulnerable or more likely to engage in this behavior. It's not about where you're from.
Yeah.
It's about what you're doing and what you're planning on doing. And again, you can't draw a one-to-one relationship between thought and action,
Yeah.
but as a security service, we had a lower level of investigative authority. We needed reasonable grounds to suspect, which is lower than reasonable grounds to believe, which is what law enforcement requires in Canada. So we had a legislative mandate to investigate people who were just musing about the possibility of engaging in violence.
Mm.
That was an advantage that we had. And if it got to the point where they were clearly planning things that are violent, well, you turn that over to law enforcement because they're the ones that can collect with evidentiary standard.
Yeah.
CSIS does not collect evidence, collects intelligence. They can collect evidence, make arrests, lay charges, and go to court. So I think that it's important that to understand that lots of people that we end up investigating may never actually be charged with a criminal offense. Does not mean they should not have been investigated in the first place. You
Yeah.
you make that determination. You don't know what someone's going to do until you start digging and
Yeah.
turning over rocks and see what's underneath those rocks. So it's not profiling, it's not systemically racist, it's just doing our jobs in accordance with our mandate. And I think they do a pretty good job of it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. That's very interesting too. Yeah, your comments about you gathering the intelligence and law enforcement gathering their, yeah, that's interesting.
That's our model here. Other countries do it differently. The FBI, for example, is kind of like a CSIS, but it's also a law enforcement organization. So,
Yeah.
so they gather to an evidentiary standard from the get-go, which is
Okay.
why they can make arrests and lay charges.
Exactly. And I was just going to say, because look at the FBI in the States, like,
Yeah,
from what they're interesting.
exactly.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Phil. It's
My
been
pleasure.
very enjoyable. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Of course, this kind of stuff just really tweaks me, right? Um, for our viewers, anyone looking to find out information about the conference, please visit our website, www.albertacrimeprevention.com. And with that, I'll bid you a good day and stay warm, everyone, and take care.